This is Choose the Bear, where we dive deep into the power and joy of living a vibrant, independent life on your own terms. This podcast is your go-to source for smart, fun, and insightful conversations about what it means to embrace independence and live the life you choose. I'm Kat Calvin, and together we'll explore how this movement is challenging outdated stereotypes, redefining success, and empowering people to live their best independent lives. Well, few interviews have made my blood boil as much as this one, and I am sure that it will be the same for any woman who has ever been in a workplace. I was so fortunate to be joined by researchers, authors, wonderful women, Amy Diehl and Leanne Dzubinksi, who just published the book Glass Walls, which is all about the challenges and walls that women in the workplace face, regardless of whether they are single, married, mothers, not mothers. It's just by virtue of living in a patriarchy. And the conversation is really wonderful. They're incredible. The research that they have done, the stories they present are useful and good to know, particularly because we need to know what the problems are before we can change them. I really recommend buying this book for any woman you know who works, because every person I shared this with said, oh, I have experienced the same thing, and I'm so glad to know I'm not alone. And I think that's really, really important, is that you will recognize these stories and be like, oh, it wasn't me. And they also in this book are so empowering. They offer solutions for women in the workplace. They offer solutions for men in the workplace. They really, I think, are both educational and inspirational. So I hope that this is as useful for you as it was for me, even if it is also incredibly frustrating. So enjoy. All right, well, everyone, I have to warn you, today, you may not want to be driving while you're listening to this interview. You may want to pause this, make yourself a cup of herbal tea, put on some Enya, because you're going to get a little angry. I have two brilliant women who also must have the patience of saints, because they wrote a book that we are all going to really deeply identify with. So I am here with Amy Diehl and Leanne Dzubinksi, who wrote a book called Glass Walls, Shattering the 6 Gender Bias Barriers, still in italics, as it should be, holding women back at work. The thing that was surprising to me about this book, I swear, I checked the publishing date like 4 times, because I was like, was this written in 1972? Was not. It was published last year. And it's all about the unbelievable barriers that women still face in the workplace. So we're going to dive into it. But before we start, Amy, Leanne, tell us about you. Who are you?
Well, I'll start. Amy Diehl, I am a Chief Information Officer. I'm currently serving at Wilson College in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, and I'm a gender equity researcher and obviously an author. So I started out in IT, like I was a computer science major, and I started in the field of IT. And as I was working in IT, I started to realize that I wasn't being treated the same, given the same respect as my male counterparts. And yet at the same time, I was looking to them to figure out how to be an IT leader. But what I found was that my leadership wasn't accepted like theirs was. And for a long time, I was taking that personally. I thought I was at fault. And so what happened was at a certain point, I started to realize maybe it's not me. Maybe this is something that's happening to other women. I'm going to research it. So I started a PhD program. And when I started that program, I started doing all of my assignments that I could on gender barriers affecting women at work. And I quickly found out I was not alone and it was not me. And in fact, these gender biases are happening to lots of women. And as I've come to find out, I think it's almost all of us. And it probably is all of us, even if we don't recognize it. But 10 years ago, after I finished my PhD, I went to a conference in Utah where I met up with Leanne, and we started comparing our notes on our two respective dissertation studies. I had looked at the challenges women were in higher education were having, and Leanne had looked at the challenges that women in faith-based organizations were having. And we found out that we quickly discovered that basically they were the same challenges. It didn't matter that higher education was more progressive and more liberal, and faith-based or religion was more conservative. At the core, the barriers that these women experienced were exactly the same. So I'm going to let Leanne take it from there and tell a little bit about her background.
Yeah, thanks, Amy. So I am currently Dean of Faculty Development and Global Education at Westmont College. This is a brand new role for me, and my first time being full-on administrator and not partially professor and partly in administration. And my experience parallels Amy's in some ways very closely. Started out in my field, faith-based nonprofits, gung-ho, trained, ready, a female-dominated industry, by the way, and discovered very, very quickly that women ran into all kinds of obstacles. And I think one of the ones that drove me the craziest was the men who were in charge going, "We don't have any good women in this organization." And I'm just looking at them like, are you crazy? Open your eyes. Look at what all these fantastic women are doing. And so kind of like Amy, this propelled me into academic study of what is this that's going on? I'm experiencing it, my friends are experiencing it, and the men seem utterly oblivious. And so I studied women leaders in faith-based nonprofits. And like Amy said, when we first started looking at our lists, we honestly, we thought we would have very different things because we thought the environment was going to be so important, and it wasn't. And so that has propelled us on this journey of working together now for a good solid 10 years to try to unpack and define and name and identify the issues, because we think if we identify them, we have a much better chance of getting rid of them.
And one thing I want to say before we even get started is that I know when I was going into the book, I was thinking, oh, well, this is like women in corporate America, whatever. This probably is to have to do with me. But then I thought about it, and I run a nonprofit. I've worked for myself for a really long time. But there's so many instances where I've gone through the same thing, even though I don't have a boss, right? And like nonprofit fundraising, Black women raise 0.3% of foundation funding. And I have had situations where I've had donors ask me to do really crazy things, and I've asked male friends who have funded by the same people, did you have to do all this? And they're like, no, I never had to do any of that, and got way more money. I had a man look me in the eye and say he didn't think a woman could run the organization that I had founded and had been running for many years, and so for anyone listening who thinks like, oh, well, I work for myself or this or that, if you think about it, and when you read this book, you're going to recognize things and be like, oh, wait a second, I forget that actually, no, this happens to all of us, even if they're literally our own bosses.
That's right, because these biases are not only ingrained in individual workplaces and inside of hierarchies, right, organizational hierarchies, but they're in society. So you go out to fundraise, or you go out to talk to external people, or like there was examples of women in the medical field who experienced, sexual harassment from their patients, for example, women who are servers in restaurants experiencing it from their customers, right? It's just so ingrained in society that unfortunately, very unfortunately, none of us can avoid it.
No, that's absolutely true. And I wanted to point out, so Leanne also wrote a book, Women in the Mission of the Church. And I was going to throw some questions into this interview, but it was so interesting, and I'm so into the book that, spoiler, I'm just going to ask you to come on again.
Okay, I'll do that.
It'll be like a 3-hour interview because I have so many questions for I'll put the link to both books in the show notes, and Women in the Mission of the Church is also really, really interesting. All right, so I want to start with sort of the first question that is about sort of what the podcast is about generally, which is you have some different parts in the book where you talk about the biases that single childless women face at work. So can you talk about what you found as far as what those biases are? But then one thing that I really like about your book is that you put in suggestions for how women can overcome these challenges. So what some of those solutions could be.
Yeah, so I'll start. So I want to first preface this by saying I was a single and childless woman. I had been for most of my career. In fact, I didn't get married until the age of 44. I only had a baby very recently at the age of 49. So my experience, I almost feel more aligned to people who are single and childless than I do to like women who are married with children. Even though I feel aligned to both. But I remember give you an anecdote. One day, I was 40 years old. I had just finished my PhD, and I was at lunch at work. And there was an older woman who was retired who came back for lunch. Like she came back to have lunch with our lunch group. And she starts talking to me, and she's like, "Oh, Amy, what's new with you?" And I'm like, "Oh, I just finished my PhD." And she's like, "Oh, well, how old are you?" And I'm like, "Well, I'm 40." And she's like, "Are you married?" I was like, "No." And she said, "You're 40 years old and you've never been married?" And like she said it very, very loudly, like the whole rest of the table, could hear exactly what she was saying. And I was just kind of like taken aback, like, okay, first of all, I'm at work, right? This isn't like my family reunion, right? This is this is the workplace. And secondly, I don't know what it had to do with anything, right? And just her disbelief, that I could be 40 and not married. Fortunately, I had a friend who was sitting at the table and overheard this, and my friend was a few years older than me, and she said, "I'm 44, however old I am." She said, "I'm 44 and I've never been married." So she totally, like my colleague, like totally stood up for me. And I was like so grateful for that. But it really, it just really reminded me of the biases that we have that if you're a woman, you should be married. And if you're a woman, you should be a mother. And so, so what Leanne and I did was we wrote an article for Harvard Business Review about the challenges that all women face, and in particular, women who don't have children. And what we found is that it really didn't matter whether women had children or didn't have children, they were still coming up against what we call like a maternal wall. One of the things was that they were assumed that even if they didn't have children, they were assumed that they wanted children or would have children in the future. And even women that said, "Oh, it had been an interview situation." We had like a woman who said, "I'm not planning to have children. I don't want children." Like she's like, "I don't think I was believed because the people that asked me that question in an interview setting did not hire me." Um, so this bias we call maybe baby bias, like a woman of childbearing age might have a baby, and so therefore she's a risk to be hired into a role. Women were also expected to do. Childless women were also expected to do more. I, in particular, faced this in my roles as in the IT field, where I was the one that was expected to stay late and take care of the server or whatever the issue was that was going on. And I had colleagues with children that were like, "I've got kids, I've got to leave, so you can fix it." And that has to do with, I think this is, again, this assumption about children, right? And the assumption is that if women don't have children, what else could they possibly have to do? They're literally not bearing the next generation's children. They can't possibly have anything else in their life. Where we know that all of us have lives, with or without children. All of us have personal things that we like to do. We have obligations to other family members, to our friends, to our pets, right? So it's completely irrelevant. But yet the childless women were looked at as having nothing else to do. And then another thing was that they were paid less. There's something called a fatherhood premium, where men with children make more than everyone else in the workplace. And so many women we've heard this from in our research who've been given the excuse of, "Oh, he's got a family to support, so therefore he deserves a raise." Whereas the women were like, whether they had a husband or a family or not, their money was seen for just for fun money, as opposed to being like contributing to their own their own life or to the lives of their people in their family. And then finally, what we call never quite right, and that's the interpretation I give to the anecdote I told you about with the woman who couldn't believe that I was 40 and not married. No matter the never quite right bias is no matter what a woman is, no matter what identity she has, she holds or doesn't hold, there's something never quite right about her. And this is just one of the things, whether she has kids or doesn't have kids, she's not quite a fit. And so those are the things that we found that in our research that the childless women were facing. And I'm going to turn it over to Leanne to talk about what can we do to overcome some of these biases.
Yeah. So Amy, I think it's important to also point out in your story
Mhm.
and validate this point that you just told that woman you finished your PhD. I mean, that's a phenomenal accomplishment. She didn't even acknowledge that. It's like she couldn't see you as a smart, accomplished, intellectual woman. She just veered off on this gender thing of you had to be a parent. And that it's appalling to me. There you go, Kat. Little anger. Here we go. And, in my other research, I had single childless women tell me of stories where male leaders in the faith-based organizations came to them and asked them to quit what they were doing and come become an administrative assistant. It's just mind-boggling to me, this belief that is so baked into our society that women are there to serve the men and to support the men, as if that's all women are there for, right? Anyway, okay, but I'm supposed to be doing solutions, so I'm going to change my tone and talk about what we could do for this. So Amy and I are really strong on making recommendations for leaders. We don't want to be telling women, you have to change this or you have to do that another way. There are places to advocate for yourself, but we really like to focus on what leaders and organizational power holders can do to make things better. And so most workplaces have some kind of flexibility. So promote flexibility as the leader and don't be judgy about it. Don't critique this person who leaves early because they have to take their dog to the vet, but praise this person who leaves early to get their kid from the soccer game. Like, if you have flexibility, make it equally available and valued for everyone. And do it yourself if you're the leader. Model what you want your employees to be doing. Recognize that what you say about you can't say things about women that you wouldn't say about men. So what we call it is the flip it to test it approach. So if you're talking about hiring a woman, like Amy was saying, don't say, well, are you going to need time off for children if you wouldn't ask a male candidate that? Make these things equitable across the board. And then Amy talked about extra work. That's another huge pitfall where people who are in the office get stuck with taking over colleagues' responsibilities. And it's just completely unfair. So you need to figure out better systems and better structures where you can pay for overload compensation in higher ed. That's a thing, for example, or you have enough people, you literally have enough employees to get the work done, even if someone does have to be out for a little bit. You don't just assume that someone can do extra work for no pay. And then we recommend doing a pay audit to make sure that this fatherhood premium stuff hasn't crept into your organization, because it will creep in and you're going to have to repeat these pay audits periodically to make sure that pay is equitable based on job responsibilities, not family status. And then the last thing we really want to encourage is modeling ways of disconnecting this wrong belief that only women are caregivers. Men are caregivers too, and men need to step up and model and let people see when they're doing those things to normalize it so that it doesn't become just a woman's burden.
No, so that article in HBR, How Biases About Motherhood Impact All Women at Work, will be linked to the show notes. I thought it was really interesting. And I thought that, as someone who doesn't have children, I saw maternal wall and I was like, oh, well, that probably doesn't apply to me. And then I read it. I was like, oh, no, of course it does, because of course we're all judged by this. I think I want to go back to sort of the suggestions, because those are great. And so my organization, I run it. It's mostly women. Not because we haven't hired men, but because we usually have to fire them for sexism, which there are jobs they could be fired for. And then I'm like, how surprised, this whole organization is run by women. And then I'm like, oh, right, because you come from the world. But here, sexism is actually a fireable offense, and they can never believe it. But we also, I try to model those things. We have unlimited vacay because I have a lot of moms and single moms on my team, and they were always having kids are always in the hospital. I don't know what they're doing, but it's like they're constantly trying to commit suicide. They're always in the hospital. They always have a thing. And like moms were always having to count how many days that they had to take off. And I was like, this can't be right. Like, if you need to take off. And I don't actually even need to know why you're taking off. And I feel like if you don't have to ask me, it will, I won't even be able to have my internal biases come out. And so then I realized unlimited vacay was a thing. And I was like, oh, this is great. And now everyone can just pop off whenever they want for whatever. And it took a while for me to model, I take a lot of vacations and modeling taking off. And now I have people who it's my birthday, I want to take the day off. And I'm like, yes, we've succeeded. people realize they can just leave. I don't really care as long as you get your job done. But that was something that I was able to do as the leader of the organization, and which made it a little easier for the women who are listening and are not the leaders of their organizations. How can they advocate up in order to try to make changes in their organization if they're not in a position of power?
So that's a really good question. It's something that we get asked, I think, a lot, and it comes back. It's sort of the question of like, I'm an individual woman. This is happening. What can I do, right? And first of all, kudos to you, Kat, for making sexism a fireable offense in your organization. And almost every other organization that I have come into contact with, that I have knowledge of, sexism is just, in the worst case, it's just normalized. And in the better cases, it's like, actually something that somebody's talked to about. And even that's pretty rare. So to take the stance of like, we are not going to accept that here, like, just kudos to you. Like that, this needs to be like denormalized and made fireable in all organizations. But getting back to your question about what can individual women do? Like, honestly, that's a hard one because it's hard to put the onus for fixing the problem on the victims of the problem, when really the onus needs to be put on the leaders of the organization, like yourself, in your example of saying, we're not going to tolerate this here. But we always come back to like, I'm an individual woman and this is happening to me, what do I do? And the first thing you want to do is find the supportive people in your organization. Is it your boss? Is it your boss's boss? Is it the people in HR? Find the people that get it and that maybe have more power than you to do something. And then, kind of start the conversation there with like, this is what I see happening. This is the result for me, especially if it's happening to you personally. This is the result to me personally, and this is what it means for me and my ability to do my job. And kind of try in your own, as much as you can, to try to put to turn the issue over to the people who are responsible in your organization. Because when you're the person at the bottom, you really do have like no power, but you've got little power to completely change the whole organization. So you got to really work on advocacy in terms of first of all improving your own situation, and then thinking about how can you help to improve the situation for others, as well as the other thing you can do is just be an ally. We always think of allies as like men, like in this situation, men, people who are an outsider. I mean, ally can be somebody who's an insider too. So if you're a woman, think about how you can support your other women colleagues, especially in the moment. If you see bias happening to them, try to call it out. If you don't feel comfortable calling it out in the moment, go to that person and say, hey, I saw this happening. What can I do to support you? If you can, form a coalition or a team of like-minded people, that can also be really effective. And Leanne, I don't know if you wanted to add anything to what I just said.
Yes, advocating for yourself can be really hard for women. We're socialized not to stand up for ourselves. Mm-hmm. So it may take some energy, and you may need a friend or an ally to kind of help mm-hmm. you. In all likelihood, if it's happening to you, it's happening to other people in your workplace too. You're not going to be alone. And at the end of the day, I think the only other thing I would add, Amy, and I would say is you don't have to stay forever. And if you try these strategies, you report up, you go through the proper channels, you do the things, and nothing is happening, it's actually okay to leave, right? You need to, at the end of the day, take care of yourself. And if the situation is untenable and it's not changing and you're having all the illness and consequences in whatever form, start looking around to use your options and make a change, because there's plenty of workplaces. There's lots of jobs. You could be an entrepreneur. They could be a Cat Calvin, right? And start our own thing. So it's so easy to feel like you get stuck. And we just want to say to women, don't get stuck.
There's a great story that I think is such a good example of how men can be allies. So MASH, one of the greatest television shows of all time, mm-hmm. which I watched the entirety of during law school, because that's law school. Loretta Swift, who plays Hot Lips Houlihan, she has this story about how whenever they were having cast meetings, she would speak and everyone would pretend that they hadn't heard her. And so one day she said something and the producers ignored it. And I don't know if it was Mike Farrell or Alan Alda, but one of the men waited a few minutes, and then made the same suggestion. And the producer said, "Oh, that's a great suggestion." And he said, "Oh, that's funny. Why didn't you think so when Margaret said it 5 minutes?" Right. And like, it's things like that that are so powerful and that men can do to point out what's happening and that people have to listen to. And particularly, if you're a manager, right? Like, they were the stars of the show. They were someone people had to listen to. And so I think that for men, because believe it or not, I think there are probably like two good guys out of there. One of them is Keanu Reeves. One of them is someone else. Like, but if you are trying really to be an ally and to be active, I always love that example as a very clear way of how you could do it. So another thing that I noticed, and this is, I know it's in your HBR article, I think it's also in the book, but it's shocking to me because it is actually illegal in every single corner of this country to ask a woman about her marital status or her children or pregnancy in an interview, but it's still somehow all the time. I'm sorry, my mind is so blown on how this happens, but it does, I have to accept it. But of course, we know just because something's illegal doesn't mean that there's any justice. Meaning that saying it's illegal means then you have to, get a lawyer and you have to sue. It's very expensive. Like, there's all these things. And so it's really hard to advocate for yourself. So when a woman is asked in an interview about her children or her marital status, or is, something that's illegal like that blatantly, what do you recommend, both as a response in the moment and also as what she can do after?
Do you want to start, Leanne?
That's a great question, and I feel like I should defer to the lawyer on that one.
There is, but that.
I've experienced this working in the faith-based world. I was asked, my husband was actually interviewed for one of the jobs, so I'll just tell you that flat out, which that organization eventually realized was illegal and they quit doing, but I got subjected to that. And I honestly struggled with how to handle that. What do I do? Do I say, no, you can't make my husband come in here and talk to you? Or do I say, I need this job, I paste a smile on my face and I go with it? And I think, honestly, I would say for women, any of those choices is okay in the moment because you're flooded, you're panicked, you don't know what to do. Maybe you really need the job. And so if you just cave and answer the question, don't beat yourself up later. And if you resist and say, hey, I don't think you're allowed to ask me that. Like now, a few years on, I would probably say, I'm pretty sure you're not allowed to ask me that question. And I would try to, make it sound lighthearted, but I think it would be okay, perfectly okay to refuse. But afterwards, I don't know. Amy, you want to tackle afterwards? What do you do afterwards?
Well, I'll also talk in the moment. One thing is, unfortunately, I think we as women do need to kind of expect the question and think about what we might answer going into an interview. So as you're interview prepping all of the, legal questions, think about how you would answer a question that's not legal. And so there's two things I would say to that. One is think about if that's a place you really want to work, if they're asking you such questions, right? Is that a job you'd really want to take? But in the second case, let's make an assumption that, somebody just, is being too casual. Hey, are you thinking of having children or whatever? Think about how you might answer that. One way is to, this came from one of our research participants, by the way. One way is to deflect it. So like the question of, are you planning to have children? One of the participants said their response was, well, I'm really focusing on my career right now. So giving an answer that's like a non-answer, and turns it back to the questions related to the job, is a good way to handle that. After the fact, what you all have brought up is so true. The reason that this keeps happening is because the employers, they know that what it would take for a woman or a person who's asked a discriminatory question in an interview, what it would actually take for them to do something about it, right? Filing an EEOC complaint, getting a lawyer, and another quote that came from our interview participants, we have this in the book, is, someone said, who wants to, go get a lawyer, over something that, over, in particular, perhaps like a lower or middle wage job. And, so unfortunately, the thing that I would say, the practical advice I would give would be think about whether you want to really work for that company or not. And then in your own circles, I would just talk to other, I would let it be known, like maybe not out on a public forum or whatever, but if I have other people that are interested in, or, perhaps interviewing with the same organization, and they came to me, I would probably let it be known, like what my experience was, interviewing, just so that they could be, given some advantage of knowing that this place might be more discriminatory than what the average workplace is.
Yeah, I mean, I think unfortunately it's true. There's not a ton, EEOC complaints move slowly, but occasionally they move, and it's probably the lowest barrier thing you do. But I do like the suggestion of prepare ahead of time for the good and bad questions. So one of the things you talk about in the book is the concept of devaluation, which I really felt struck at sort of the heart of the issue. Can you talk a little bit about what devaluation is and how it appears in the workplace?
Yeah.
Sure.
Oh, go ahead.
That's right. I'll start and you can pick up.
Yep.
So devaluation is this thing that we found in our data that we call attempts to make women seem unimportant and detract from their authority at work. So it can be everything from expecting and assuming that women will do the office housework, which is things like taking notes in a meeting or bringing coffee for the team or cleaning up, the kitchen after the meeting. It can be benevolent sexism, where men sort of see themselves as protectors of the women and having authority over them, but then that devalues the women's personal choice and personal agency. And another way it shows up is what we have called credibility deficit, when a woman is not believed or her expertise is not believed. So if you've ever made a statement about something that you know perfectly well and had somebody, typically a man, say, "Are you sure that's right?" Or worse, ask the man standing next to you, "Is she right?" Then you've just experienced credibility deficit. And these are all ways of sort of diminishing women and making them less authoritative and less important at work.
Yeah, and you'll just add on to that credibility deficit. It gets like this stuff is all infuriating, but it gets really infuriating when a woman experiences sexual harassment in the workplace and takes the step of reporting it and is not believed, and is basically just told it's his word against your word, and so we're not going to do anything about it. That's where this stuff really like just puts me over the edge. Whereas it's all disrespectful. A credibility deficit, if you know about it in the moment, maybe there's something you can do to counter that. But it's, you've been sexually harassed or sexually assaulted, and you go to make a report of that, and you are basically flat out told that, you're not believed. And I look at that as a woman, and I'm like, who in their right mind, as a woman, who would lie about that? Who would put themselves through what we know that victims are put through, unless it actually happened, right? So we all need to think about that, when in terms of when women are reporting this stuff, that it's the percentages of women who lie about these things are very, very, very low, and it's something in society that we need to root out.
And it's, as you were talking about credibility deficit, it's not just at work, because I was just thinking of that just happened to me last week. Like social setting. I was talking about how it's me to drive from my house in LA to my house in Arizona, and this guy corrected me. How long it takes me to drive from my house to my house. You don't know, but like it's such an instinct with men to just assume that you're stupid, which is so but I feel like that is something we see in so many parts of our lives and in so many interactions with men, that it's not surprising that we see it at work. It's just extra infuriating, because now you're with my livelihood and my career. So when we're looking at, all of sort of individual things that can be done in the workplace to solve these problems, but on a larger scale, do you have thoughts or ideas on how this can be addressed from a policy perspective?
Yeah, I think that the solutions, like actually the policy solutions, are probably the easier solutions, in terms of it's just a matter of getting the right people into the right seats, into the right seats in our government, into the right seats on organizational boards, to create policies that are support diversity, inclusion, for everyone. But it's actually one of the easier. So it's easier than changing a whole culture, right? But I think that's where we really need to start, because you start with good policies, that can then permeate down into the culture. And I'll just give you one example. President Biden proposed the Build Back Better plan, which included some paid parental leave, right? And that was opposed by certain older male senators, or at least one that I'm thinking of, as being, and his complaint about it was, oh, that's too expensive. That costs too much money. Well, when they bring a defense bill up, do they ever get the pushback that it costs too much money and they can't pass it? No. So like we need to think about, like, as we're voting, who are we voting for? Are we voting for people that will put forward solutions and policies that will impact like people, whether we have children, don't have children, whether we are of the white race or whether we're a person of color, or whether we have a disability, or, or like, who are we putting into office, and who are making these decisions? So I think that, that the policy angle is like, it's the more, I won't say it's easy, but it's the more straightforward way to start to get an inclusive environment, started from the top.
Yeah. All right. Last question. Hopefully we can end this on a hopeful note. What makes you hopeful about the future of women at work, if anything?
When I look at history, I do see that we've made some progress. I hear my mom's stories and my grandmother's stories, and my stories are bad, but they're not as bad. And then I look at my nieces and daughters and younger students, and their stories are bad, but maybe not as bad. So I do see that we have made gains. At the same time, we have to keep working, right? We can't, there was a push a little while back to say, oh, we got there. Well, we didn't get there. It's kind of like saying, well, I only need to eat on January 1st and then I'm done for the year. That just doesn't work, right? We have to stay consistent with this stuff and keep working on it. But I believe in women. I believe women are creative and resilient and strong, and that if we work together, we really can make change. And so that's, I think, at the end of the day, what keeps me going is that there are things we can do to make the world better for ourselves and for those around us.
Yeah, I totally agree that I think the issue is that the change is not as fast as any of us would like. Like, we would just like to wake up today and have a completely equitable world where women are viewed as another gender, but not any less, not of any less value than men. But we know that that's not the way it works. And the other thing that I'll say too is that we've had progress. It's been slow progress. I completely agree with Leanne. I think about my own mother. When she went to college, her choices for careers were like nursing or teaching or secretarial. So she had she went to college and she had some choice, but it was very, very constrained. Whereas now, there are more women in college than men. But we know that then the barriers then are in the workplace pipelines. So the change is, we are progressing much slower than we would hope. But that's the thing that does keep me going, is that, as we wrote this book, as we're doing the research, we're like, we just need to shine a light on what's happening. It can make us angry, and that's good. Anger will inspire us to make change that's needed. But we need to shine a light on this. So we shine a light on it, name the things that didn't have names, call it out. We can really make change and help these things to go away little by little. So I think we are moving society forward. It's just much slower than we would than any of us would hope.
Yes. Well, and I'll say your book has given me a lot of hope. And one thing that I would recommend to everyone who's listening is buy this book and give it to a man, because every woman reading this, it'll be great. It'll be validating. It'll be infuriating. We'll be like, oh yeah, we recognize this. We're not the ones who need to read this though. Men need to read this book, and men understand that this is happening, because I think so much of it is that they just really literally do not see it. And I think that glass walls really can be a real mechanism for change. If you are in a powerful position or any position of authority or management at work, I would say buy this for all the men in your office. it's for everybody so that there's no bias, but make them and read it, have a little book club, because that's who needs to see this. But I think that it's books and studies like this. And I was so glad to see your article in HBR, which is written or read by a lot of men, right? And so like, I think this kind of work is exactly what we need in order to move things forward. So Leanne and Amy, I'm so glad you wrote this book. I'm so glad that you're doing the work you do. And thank you for being on this podcast, really.
Oh, thank you so much for having us on.
Thanks, Kat. It's been great.
Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe, share, and of course, leave a review. Until next week, here's hoping you find joy in your solo life.